There is a quiet misunderstanding that has followed certain people all their lives, a label placed on them too quickly. They're distant, cold, antisocial. But what if we've been wrong? What if the ones who step away from the noise are not escaping life, but actually seeing it more clearly? There is a subtle but powerful difference between being alone and feeling lonely, and most people never take the time to truly understand it. Loneliness is a state of absence, a quiet ache that comes from disconnection, from feeling unseen or unheard even in the presence of others. Solitude, on the other hand, is a choice, an intentional step inward rather than outward. It is not about lacking company. It is about discovering that your own presence can be enough. People who embrace solitude are not running away from the world. They are returning to themselves. And in a society that constantly pushes outward validation, that return becomes a rare and almost radical act. When someone is comfortable being alone, it usually means they have built a relationship with themselves that most people avoid. They have learned how to sit with their thoughts without immediately trying to silence them. They have faced moments of discomfort without needing to escape into distraction. This is not something that happens overnight. It often comes after periods of reflection, sometimes even after pain, where the only option left was to turn inward and listen. In that listening, they begin to recognize their own patterns, their fears, their desires, and their truths. What others might call isolation becomes, for them, a space of understanding. In solitude, there is no audience to impress and no expectations to perform. There is only honesty, and honesty, when it is not filtered through the need for approval, can be both confronting and liberating. People who develop this connection with themselves start to rely less on external validation because they already know who they are. They do not need constant reassurance because their sense of worth is not built on how others perceive them. This does not mean they reject relationships or connection with others. It simply means those connections are no longer a necessity for identity. They become a choice rather than a dependency. This kind of self-connection also creates clarity. When the noise of constant interaction fades, thoughts become easier to understand. Emotions that were once buried under distractions begin to surface, not to overwhelm, but to be acknowledged. In this process, people start to recognize what truly matters to them, separate from what they have been told should matter. They become more aligned with their values, more aware of their boundaries, and more intentional with their decisions. Instead of reacting to life, they begin to respond to it with awareness. There is also a quiet confidence that grows from this relationship with oneself. It is not loud or attention-seeking, but it is steady and grounded. It comes from knowing that no matter what happens externally, there is an internal space that remains stable. This confidence does not depend on circumstances or approval. It is rooted in self-understanding. And because of that, people who are comfortable in solitude often move through the world differently. They are less likely to chase things that do not align with them, less likely to compromise their values for acceptance, and less likely to lose themselves in the expectations of others. Solitude, in this sense, becomes a form of strength. It teaches patience because there is no rush to fill silence. It teaches resilience because facing yourself requires courage. And it teaches authenticity because without the pressure to perform, there is no reason to be anything other than who you truly are. Over time, this creates a sense of inner peace that cannot be easily shaken because it is not dependent on external conditions. It is built from within, slowly and intentionally, through moments of stillness that many people are too afraid to experience. There is a quiet distinction between those who seek constant stimulation and those who seek meaning, and it often reveals itself in the way people choose to connect with the world around them. Some are drawn to movement, to crowded conversations, to the fast rhythm of attention where everything happens quickly and fades just as fast. Others move differently. They are not interested in how much is being said, but in what is truly being expressed. For them, communication is not about filling silence. It is about discovering something real within it. This is why people who prefer being alone often develop a natural resistance to noise, not just physical noise, but emotional and intellectual noise as well. Noise can take many forms. It can be the endless exchange of words that carry little meaning, the surface-level interactions that never move beyond politeness, or the constant need to stay engaged in conversations that do not nourish the mind or the heart. While many people adapt to this without questioning it, those who value depth begin to feel a quiet exhaustion from it. They sense that something is missing, that beneath all the activity there is very little substance. And instead of continuing to participate in what feels empty, they choose distance, not as a rejection of others, but as a commitment to something more meaningful. For these individuals, depth is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It is found in conversations where pauses are allowed, where thoughts are explored rather than rushed, where honesty replaces performance. They are drawn to people who are willing to go beyond appearances, who are not afraid to speak about ideas, emotions, and experiences in a way that is sincere. This is why their circle often appears small. It is not a limitation, but a reflection of their standards. They are not measuring connection by quantity, but by quality. A single genuine conversation holds more value for them than countless superficial ones. This preference also shapes the way they experience the world internally. They tend to reflect more deeply on what they encounter, taking time to process rather than moving quickly from one thing to another. When something captures their attention, they do not skim its surface, they explore it. Whether it is an idea, a feeling, or a relationship, they engage with it fully. This creates a richer inner life, one that is not dependent on constant external input. While others may need continuous stimulation to feel engaged, they find engagement in understanding, in questioning, in observing the layers that others might overlook. There is also a certain courage required to choose depth over noise, because it often means stepping away from what is common. In many environments, surface-level interaction is the norm, and choosing not to participate can be misunderstood. It can be seen as disinterest or distance, when in reality it is discernment. These individuals are not unwilling to connect. They are simply unwilling to dilute their energy on connections that lack meaning. They are selective not out of arrogance, but out of awareness. They know that where they place their attention shapes their experience, and they choose to invest it where it matters. Over time, this inclination toward depth influences not only their relationships, but also their sense of fulfillment. They are less likely to feel satisfied by temporary excitement or fleeting validation because they are attuned to something more lasting. They seek experiences that resonate, that leave an imprint, that contribute to their understanding of themselves and the world. This does not mean they reject simplicity or lightness, but even in those moments, there is a presence, a mindfulness that keeps them grounded. They are not chasing intensity for its own sake. They are seeking meaning within whatever they encounter. There is a certain kind of awareness that only grows in quiet spaces, a sensitivity that sharpens when a person is no longer competing to be heard. Those who spend time alone often develop this awareness without even realizing it. When you are not constantly speaking, performing, or reacting, your attention begins to shift outward in a different way. You start to notice details that would otherwise be lost in the rush of interaction. The rhythm of a conversation, the hesitation before someone answers, the subtle change in tone when a truth is being avoided. These things become visible to a mind that has learned to observe rather than interrupt. This heightened observation is not something that comes from effort alone. It is the natural result of stillness. In silence, the mind has space to register what is happening beyond the obvious. While others may focus only on words, observant individuals pick up on what surrounds those words. They notice inconsistencies between what is said and what is felt. They sense tension in situations where everything appears calm on the surface. It is as if they are listening to a second layer of communication, one that is not spoken but deeply present. This ability often leads them to understand people in ways that are difficult to explain, because their conclusions are based on patterns and impressions that others might overlook. Spending time alone also strengthens internal awareness, which directly influences how one perceives the external world. When a person becomes familiar with their own emotions, thoughts, and reactions, they begin to recognize similar patterns in others. This creates a kind of empathy that is grounded not in assumption, but in recognition. They are not just seeing what others show, they are interpreting what lies beneath it. This is why they can often sense when something is wrong, even when no one has said anything. It is not intuition in a mystical sense, but a refined sensitivity built through reflection and attention. Another aspect of this observant nature is patience. In a world where many people rush to speak, respond, or judge, those who are comfortable in silence tend to wait. They allow situations to unfold before forming conclusions. They give people the space to reveal themselves over time rather than relying on first impressions. This patience gives them an advantage in understanding complexity because they are not satisfied with quick answers. They are willing to sit with uncertainty, to watch how things evolve, and to gather information gradually. This often leads to insights that are more accurate and more nuanced. However, being highly observant is not always easy. Seeing more also means feeling more. When you notice details that others ignore, you become aware of contradictions, hidden tensions, and unspoken struggles. This can create a sense of distance because it becomes difficult to engage in interactions that feel inauthentic. It can also lead to moments of quiet frustration, especially when what is obvious to you remains invisible to others. Yet instead of forcing their perspective onto others, these individuals often choose restraint. They understand that not everything needs to be said, and not everyone is ready to see what they see. Over time, this ability to observe deeply becomes a defining part of how they move through the world. It influences their decisions, their relationships, and their sense of trust. They are less likely to be misled by appearances because they rely on a broader range of signals. They are more attuned to authenticity, more aware of subtle dynamics, and more capable of navigating complex social environments without losing their sense of clarity. Their silence is not emptiness but attention, a quiet presence that absorbs, interprets, and understands far more than it reveals. There comes a point in life when a person begins to realize that energy is more valuable than time, because while time moves forward no matter what, energy determines how that time is experienced. People who prefer being alone often reach this understanding earlier than others, not through theory, but through lived experience. They begin to notice how certain environments leave them drained, how some conversations feel heavy even when they seem harmless, and how being around the wrong people can create a quiet exhaustion that lingers long after the interaction has ended. This awareness becomes a turning point, a moment where they start to take responsibility for what they allow into their space. Protecting energy is not about avoidance in the sense of fear, it is about discernment. It is the ability to recognize that not everything deserves access to your attention, your presence, or your emotional investment. While many people feel obligated to say yes, to be available, or to maintain connections out of habit, those who value their energy begin to question these patterns. They understand that every interaction has an impact, whether it is visible or subtle, and they choose to engage only in what aligns with their well-being. This often leads them to step back from situations that others might tolerate, not because they are unwilling to handle difficulty, but because they see no purpose in carrying unnecessary weight. This selective approach can sometimes be misunderstood. From the outside, it may look like distance, detachment, or even indifference. People may assume that someone who withdraws is rejecting others, when in reality, they are simply choosing themselves. There is a difference between pushing people away and refusing to lose yourself in them. Those who protect their energy are not closing doors out of bitterness. They are closing them out of clarity. They have learned, often through trial and error, that being constantly available can lead to being constantly depleted, and that depletion eventually affects every part of life, from emotional stability to mental focus. Another important aspect of protecting energy is the establishment of boundaries. These boundaries are not always spoken, but they are deeply felt. They guide decisions about where to go, who to spend time with, and how much to give in any given situation. Setting boundaries requires a certain level of self-awareness because it involves recognizing personal limits without guilt. It also requires courage because it means accepting that not everyone will understand or agree with those limits. Yet, for those who have experienced the cost of not having boundaries, this becomes a necessary practice rather than an optional one. Solitude plays a significant role in restoring and maintaining this energy. Time alone is not seen as emptiness, but as renewal. It is a space where the mind can slow down, where emotions can settle, and where clarity can return. Without the constant influence of external demands, individuals can reconnect with themselves and regain balance. This makes solitude not just a preference, but a form of care. It becomes a way to ensure that when they do engage with others, they are doing so from a place of presence rather than exhaustion. Over time, this habit of protecting energy shapes the way a person lives. It leads to more intentional choices, fewer unnecessary conflicts, and a deeper sense of control over one's own experience. Instead of being pulled in multiple directions by external expectations, they move with purpose, guided by what feels right rather than what is expected. They are not trying to isolate themselves from the world, but to interact with it in a way that preserves their sense of peace. And in doing so, they create a life that feels less chaotic, more grounded, and more aligned with who they truly are. There is a quiet strength in the ability to think for oneself, a kind of inner autonomy that cannot be easily shaped by trends, opinions, or external pressure. People who prefer being alone often cultivate this strength over time, not because they are trying to be different, but because solitude naturally creates the conditions for independent thought. When a person is not constantly surrounded by voices, expectations, and influences, they begin to hear their own thoughts more clearly. They are able to question, to reflect, and to form conclusions that are not immediately filtered through the beliefs of others. This process is gradual, but it builds a foundation that is both stable and deeply personal. In many environments, thinking is often influenced by repetition. Ideas are shared, reinforced, and accepted without much examination, simply because they are common. Those who spend most of their time in constant interaction may adopt these ideas without realizing it, mistaking familiarity for truth. But individuals who are comfortable in solitude tend to pause before accepting what they hear. They do not reject ideas automatically, but they do not accept them blindly either. Instead, they take time to analyze, to compare, and to understand whether something aligns with their own reasoning and experience. This creates a mindset that is not easily swayed by popular opinion. This independence of thought is closely connected to a willingness to question. Rather than taking things at face value, they ask why. Why is something considered important, correct, or necessary? Why do certain beliefs persist even when they may not hold up under closer examination. These questions are not asked out of rebellion, but out of curiosity. There is a desire to understand rather than to conform. And in that process of questioning, they often uncover perspectives that differ from the majority. This can lead to a sense of separation at times, because thinking differently is not always comfortable in environments that favor agreement over exploration. Solitude also provides the mental space needed for deeper reflection. Without constant interruption, thoughts have the opportunity to develop fully. Ideas are not rushed or abandoned midway, they are explored from multiple angles. This kind of reflection leads to greater clarity because it allows a person to see connections, contradictions, and possibilities that might otherwise go unnoticed. Over time, this practice strengthens the ability to make decisions based on understanding rather than impulse. Instead of reacting to situations immediately, they are more likely to step back, consider their options, and respond in a way that is consistent with their values. Another important aspect of independent thinking is the reduced need for validation. When a person becomes accustomed to relying on their own judgment, they are less dependent on approval from others. This does not mean they disregard feedback or refuse to listen, but it does mean that their sense of direction is not dictated by external opinions. They are able to stand by their choices even when those choices are not widely supported. This creates a sense of freedom that is difficult to achieve when one's decisions are constantly influenced by the desire to be accepted or understood. At times, this independence can be mistaken for stubbornness or detachment, especially by those who are more comfortable with collective thinking. But there is a difference between refusing to change and choosing to think carefully before changing. People who value independent thought are open to new ideas, but they require those ideas to make sense within their own framework of understanding. They are not easily persuaded by pressure or urgency because their process is rooted in reflection rather than reaction. This can make them appear slower to decide, but it often leads to decisions that are more deliberate and aligned with who they are. Over time, this way of thinking shapes not only how they interpret the world, but also how they move through it. It allows them to create a life that reflects their own beliefs rather than borrowed ones. They are less likely to follow paths that do not resonate with them, even if those paths are widely accepted or expected. Instead, they carve out their own direction, guided by a sense of clarity that comes from within. This does not guarantee ease or simplicity, but it does create a sense of authenticity that is difficult to replicate through conformity. There is a widespread belief that strength is measured by visibility, by how present someone is in social circles, by how easily they integrate into groups and maintain constant interaction. Within this perspective, choosing to be alone is often misunderstood as a lack, as if something is missing or broken. But this assumption overlooks a deeper reality. The ability to be alone without feeling diminished requires a kind of inner stability that is not easily developed. It asks a person to stand without external reinforcement, to exist without continuous affirmation, and to find a sense of completeness that does not depend on others being present. For many, being alone can feel uncomfortable, even unsettling. Silence can bring thoughts that are difficult to face, emotions that have been pushed aside, questions that do not have immediate answers. It is often easier to stay occupied, to surround oneself with activity and interaction, to avoid that confrontation with the self. But those who embrace solitude do something different. They do not run from that discomfort, they remain with it long enough for it to transform. What begins as unease gradually becomes familiarity, and what once felt overwhelming becomes something that can be understood and managed. This process requires patience and courage because it involves facing parts of oneself that are not always easy to accept. In this sense, solitude becomes a training ground for resilience. When a person learns to be alone, they learn how to rely on themselves in a deeper way. They begin to understand that their stability does not need to collapse when external conditions change. Relationships may shift, circumstances may evolve, and environments may become uncertain, but there is an internal foundation that remains intact. This foundation is not built quickly. It is developed through repeated moments of choosing presence over avoidance, reflection over distraction, and honesty over denial. Over time, it creates a sense of strength that is quiet but unwavering. Another aspect of this inner strength is emotional independence. This does not mean a lack of connection or a refusal to engage with others. It means that one's emotional state is not entirely controlled by external influences. People who are comfortable being alone are less likely to feel lost when they are not surrounded by others, because they have cultivated a sense of continuity within themselves. They are able to process their emotions without immediately seeking distraction or reassurance, which allows them to respond more thoughtfully to what they experience. This does not make them immune to difficulty, but it does give them a greater capacity to navigate it without becoming overwhelmed. There is also a form of integrity that emerges from this strength. When a person is not dependent on constant approval or inclusion, they are more likely to remain true to their values. They are less inclined to compromise their beliefs for the sake of fitting in, because their sense of belonging is not tied exclusively to external acceptance. This creates a kind of freedom, one that allows them to make choices based on what feels right rather than what is expected. It can sometimes lead to moments of isolation, especially when their perspective differs from the majority, but it also ensures that their actions remain aligned with who they truly are.